Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So thank you so much, Simon, for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you. Could you guys first just start by giving us a little bit of a background about yourself and the work that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a little unnerving talking about yourself, but I'll give it a go. So I hold the position of Reader in International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, in the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy. And I've been working at SOAS for about 10 years now. The main focus of my work is probably in two regards. One is in the field and developing the field of sports diplomacy. And people have been kind enough to say that I've been a pioneer in that regard and working with a number of different stakeholders, particularly outside of academia. So the likes of the Foreign, Commonwealth and now Development Office, UNESCO, the World Cup campaign in 2022 in Doha and Qatar, other sport mega events, City of London, etc. And in all of these, what I'm trying to do is take an issue that I, believe in, as it were, and that I'm passionate about researching, and explain it to multiple different audiences. The second thing that I'm really impassioned about is the study of soft power. So in the burgeoning sort of years of my career, I worked for the UK Defence Academy, for King's College there, and I was exposed to lots of, as it were, the hard power. I was surrounded by students in uniform every day. It was an interesting experience in the early 2000s, going to work past someone on the gate who had a gun in the UK. It's a very sort of odd experience. But what it gave me a great deal of faith in, I think, is, on the one hand, a respect for the military, which I frankly didn't have before, but also that diplomacy is really the answer. So when you see, a Pakistani and an Indian officer out of, as it were, their environment, sitting down, their families playing together, sharing food, playing cricket, inevitably. That, to me, gives a little bit of a hint around the opportunities for diplomacy. Even nations that are, as it were, officially at war are still having a diplomatic dialogue. Now, that was in an individual, perhaps anecdotal observation, but it gave me an insight into the broader diplomatic processes. And I went from that sort of formative experience in my own academic career through to understanding how maybe there's some longer term trajectories involved here, particularly in the study of diplomacy, which stretches back to the earliest forms of polities, the earliest family groups, if you like, the sort of hunter-gatherer idea that there's, your little group over here and someone over the hill. What's that first form of communication? Are they going to come over and, bash you on the head and steal your children and run away? Or are you going to actually end up working together? If they have access to a water source and you have access to food, there's a trade-off, a negotiation that can be undertaken. So that really got me thinking about how peoples have communicated and negotiated and then therefore represented each other to each other over the long durée. And that predates this world we live in of nation states where we can easily identify little flags and lines on maps, which are a function of, a relatively recent, 300-400 year experience of the human condition. That's new, people. What we're talking about here is a much longer durée. And I think in that sense, perhaps the most telling thing that I've can reflect on as a student of diplomacy over the years is that we've arrived at, in 2021, where many, seemingly huge and impactful decisions are being made, whether it's Brexit, COVID, American presidential election, but actually putting things into the broader context, understanding some of the structural, approaches to the way we look at the world. Actually, we can deal with some of these processes, and it gives me a great deal more faith in humanity, frankly. Otherwise, I'd be just, a little bit too depressed too often.
It's really interesting that you sort of went from hard power to soft power, and the fact that you've identified soft power as this um, really human, I suppose, skill or human sort of concept. Um, but how has soft power changed over time? Like now that you have social media and you have, people projecting these massive campaigns like Black Lives Matter that now are now in sport and in marketing, and people are using it for various reasons. How has soft power evolved over time?
Well, soft power is a very slippery beast. That Joseph Nye gave form to it, and helped shape the academic debate in the 1990s and subsequently, is a useful sort of window into it. But it's something that goes back again much further. I think again part of the negotiation today that I've been part of. My first negotiation, as it were, today was with a 7-year-old to get his shoes to be put on to go to school. The negotiation skills of a 7-year-old are pretty good. No, don't want to do it. I'm not going. They're pretty hard things to get around. So, you have to exert a little bit of, as a parent, occasionally, a little bit of sort of hard power effectively, within, of course, confined constraints. But, these are some of the negotiations you have to go through. Now, negotiating with colleagues over whether a process is worthwhile within a higher education environment, or negotiating, as our Prime Minister is today, on behalf of the nation over trade deals in terms of Brexit. Whatever these things may be, there's a negotiation to go through that. And invariably, it seems to me that the soft power skills are the ones that, dare I say it, trump the hard power ones. You can have all the nuclear missiles in the world, but actually, if you can't get your will, then that's you haven't influenced and shaped the discussion. And that's really where I think Nye's contribution is, and indeed those scholars who followed him and the debates that have followed that discourse, is around an acknowledgement that they're not really 2 points at the other end of a spectrum, but really a cycle of harder and softer powers that come to play. And a lot of that's contextual. In 2009, being economically strong was hugely important. It didn't matter quite so many how many nuclear weapons you had. In 1945, it mattered how many men you had in uniform to be able to exert your will and shape the world in the way that your national interest was important. So I think that understanding of what is appropriate for its times, what's the quickest way to influence 1 million people at the moment? Is it to change the law? Is it for a marketing campaign? Is it to march down the street with tanks and guns? Probably if you send spam and it arrives in 10 million people's inboxes and 1 million people open it, you change the world far more effectively and far quicker and at far less cost, in material terms. Now, I think that has some really interesting connotations in terms of the environment and the resources that we put towards changing and shaping people's influences. Some of it can be used for malintent. There's not a very a great distance sometimes between the exertion of soft power and what in past times might have called propaganda. Taking it and shaping it for particular influences. But then I think that's where an understanding of in an academic context to a point, but also within the sort of broader body politic, thinking about the context in which soft power operates, thinking about the ways that you can shape and influence and critically analyze different sources of information. And we've seen in the last decade, certainly in the last 5 years particularly, the way that social media have, in their own way, used forms of hard power to hardwire algorithms and preferences within different social media platforms that have shaped and reinforced opinions and prevented, in some senses, spaces for discourse and disagreement and awareness of others. And I think that's where perhaps the challenge of soft power lies moving forward.
And one of the things that really caught my attention about your work is the fact that you're a pioneer in the field, but of sport diplomacy, where you look at sports and how sports contribute to whether there is a diplomatic discourse or a diplomatic relationship between two nations. So how did that idea come about?
Well, if you'll indulge me in a story for a moment, somewhat serendipitously, I ended up working for LOCOG, the London Organising Committee of the Olympic Games in 2012,
Oh,
in their international relations department. Now, that wasn't, as it were, a huge stretch for a scholar of international relations. You know,
mhm.
I'd done a master's degree in international relations. I'd worked in broadly international relations departments, but let me tell you, the international relations department of an organising committee for an Olympic Games is not the same as an academic international relations department.
Absolutely.
And that's frankly a good thing also, in my humble opinion. But what it meant was I was exposed to, at a reasonably high level, I wasn't, it was a short-term sort of arrangement that I was on in terms of employment. But it meant that I was exposed to, essentially the coalface of sport diplomacy. And at that point, they were quite distinct realms. But going through the process of that now somewhat glorious summer of 2012, not least because of the weather, but it was a really formative experience of saying, well, here's some diplomacy in practice, and here's the world's iconic sporting event, all eyes on this event over and above anything else. And with more time, I could happily ramble on about being on a called up by the police, being part of a operation to secure a recognition, being in this close to gold medals, being a part of award ceremonies, being and again, I don't want to overstate it, but being part of the dialogue and being as a scholar, being able to observe it from that position. Now that sparked an interest in really taking it further and asking the next questions, like, well, why is it this way? So what's the so what question here? Why does sport operate in this way, which in some senses mimics the international arrangement? You have national constituencies, national Olympic committees. There are 193 members of the United Nations. There are over 200 members of the IOC. So where's the dislocation? What is it about sport that enables you to be recognised? And if you think here about the refugee athletes who took part in the 2016 Olympic Games, and the idea of non-recognition within the Olympic movement, that could be as important as recognition within the United Nations system. So there are questions here about nationality, identity, questions of financial wealth. How much is it worth an Olympic gold medal? The United Kingdom, Great Britain, Team GB benefited hugely from revenues from the national lottery, which came in the mid-90s, was invested during the late 90s and early 2000s. And by the time you get to 2012, you can put a cost on. This gold medal cost £1.24 million.
Wow.
That kind of trajectory. So if you're invested in the huge multi-million-dollar business of sport on the one hand, the social impact, we talked a lot about, and indeed it was integral to the campaign about legacy. What was the legacy going to be for Stratford, for the youth of London? One of the reasons, which by all accounts was determinant in the UK winning the bid, was the fact that Sebastian Coe took those children to Singapore for the bid announcement in 2005. Now, tracking the trajectory, as it were, of those individual children, but also of the sort of the age groups, and where did they end up? What has been the impact? And in short, it's been, looking back from 2020, pretty patchy. There's some wonderful facilities in Stratford, in London. There's some important narratives that were going on at, Super Saturday, Mo Farah's achievements, Jess Ennis, all of these things that, as someone, the sports fan, you can look back on and go, wow. But at what cost? What was the offset? How many hospitals were not built? How many, treatments were not undertaken because the sport was prejudiced in other ways? Now, some senses, one or another person might say, well, that was worthwhile or that was not. And those are the circumstances of, the sort of, broader meta conflicts that, society exists in, the choices that we all have to make and the consequences we have to live with. But I think in the realm of sport, you then extrapolate that through to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and look at what can sport contribute to the likes of sustainability, education, gender equality. what could be more empowering than seeing female athletes on the Olympic podium from countries where their rights are different, from what we might see as good equality rights in the United Kingdom? There's a whole bunch of debates that can be opened up because of that, in a way that you might not be able to do otherwise. You think about the opportunities that particularly young girls have through sport that they don't have in other walks of life. So I think sport has a huge transformative capacity. It also has, potential cost, and it certainly has potential risk. But that, I think, is the sort of broad overview, if you like, of taking why sport diplomacy, from my individual point of view, has been something that sort of really got me thinking, and the fact that I've been able to take that through. And my dean has been kind enough to say that I've founded a field of study because of it.
That's really interesting, and sort of the whole story in itself is kind of speaks to what sport is, in the fact that so many different aspects of everyday life somehow manage to find their way into sport. And for the example that comes to my mind is obviously Stratford. I grew up in Stratford, and we're literally like 5 minutes from the Olympic Stadium. So to me, having grown up in this area, and you spoke about legacy and the narratives after the Olympics about what things are going to be and whatever. In my mind, and from what I saw, there were amazing developments and stuff like that. But one of the key things that we noticed was a fracture in community. There was a massive fracture in community, in that the prices of property soared. People had to end up moving out, and they could no longer stay there and be around their families and communities and stuff like that. And so it created these fractures. So it's really interesting that there are so many dynamics in sport. But what also is more fascinating to me about the stuff that you've been looking at and working on is the fact that there is sort of a national need to want to project excellence, sporting excellence. Now, how much of that need do you think is an exertion of power?
Well, I think there's an easy, perhaps a default overlap in that regard. If you look back to the era of the Cold War, there was very much a notion that success in sport, particularly in Olympic events, led to success in the sort of geopolitical space. You can think of the Miracle on Ice in 1980, the tit-for-tat boycotts between 1980 and 1984 between Moscow and Los Angeles. And there certainly perhaps is something to that. The investment in sport from nations like East Germany, now it came with a very dark side in terms of the doping, of athletes, and literally the humanitarian consequences of that. But the mantra was that was worthwhile for the nation. That was in the national interest to take young athletes, often as young as under 10, and dope them up to become Olympic champions. That was their state policy. That wasn't a rogue coach doing something untoward. That was national policy. So and East Germany had big fish to fry. Frankly, sat there in the middle of Europe with nuclear weapons pointing back and forth. They could have spent their resources, their energies, on other things, but they chose to spend it to the within reason on that kind of priority. And other nations have done that, perhaps with less detrimental consequences. Jamaica, for example, over the course of the last 15 years, has spent a huge amount on its track athletes, possibly to the exclusion of its cricketers, you might say, for want of another sport. But I bet most people could name a Jamaican track athlete, as one obvious one, as it were, rather than the Jamaican prime ministers for the last decade. So sometimes sport can give you that status, that international prowess. And don't underestimate the importance, particularly in diplomacy, of status and power in that regard. Appealing to someone else's better instincts, as it were, may not carry as much weight as victory. There's something about and sport provides that fulcrum. In some senses, it provides a safe space. I would rather that Iran and the United States played a football match, then they fought it out and a battle in another sense.
Absolutely.
So you can, see how these different dialogues play out, and particularly within, sport, you have an escalatory dimension, but you also have a de-escalatory capacity. You can actually have some conversations in the margins of it. You have to go through a negotiated process around a fixture list, where it's going to take place, what time it's going to kick off, what are the rules of the game. The idea of, and again, sport infiltrates particularly the English language very much so. It's like, what are the rules of the game? You could talk about that, in terms of diplomacy. What are what's the agenda? When are we going to have the fixture list? One of the things about sport and diplomacy is there's always another fixture. There's always next year. There's always the year after. There's always, you have the opportunity to change the narrative. You may have lost this week, but you can win next week. You get to play that opposition again. Even if all the players change, even if the field changes, even if the stadium changes, you still get to have that dialogue. And that goes back to what Richelieu called, the négociation continuelle, the idea of continual negotiation. You don't ever win, but by continuing to negotiate and discuss and be in a dialogue, you make sure you don't lose.
Yeah, to interplay.
Sorry?
So is it like an interplay in terms of like
Yeah. So you're always engaged in the game. Forgive me. So you don't ever, victory is only, ephemeral. The United States may have won the Cold War. Maybe not. There's a huge discussion there. But, it was onto the next discussion, onto the next fixture, onto the next discourse. So, you've broken the world record. You're the fastest man in the world. Someone will come and beat you. You've won the European Cup. Someone else will win it next year. Maybe it's you again, but at some point, someone else will win it. Yeah. So these are the kinds of dialogues that enable, great drama, huge emotion. And again, this is one of the tensions I see in the study of sport and diplomacy. On the one hand, you can think of diplomacy as the sort of cold, hard, negotiation, emotionless, just down the line. And on the other hand, sport can give you such, it gives me at least, and I know vast swathes of people around the world, such an opportunity for emotional expression. Some euphoric moments of a life in that sense. But you then, put those two things together and you have a wonderful sort of creative tension, I think. And I think that's where, there's a lot to be said for understanding both sides of the negotiation.
I mean, that you put it so eloquently, and I think there's so many things that you can unpack in that. But I want to get into sort of the fact that sport can bring to the table what politics doesn't necessarily afford or can't bring together. So, for instance, you mentioned in your article about the untold story of the 1966 World Cup that the African nations obviously boycotted the World Cup in England. But what you pointed to was, which was much more interesting for me, was the fact that there was a African Football Confederation that predated the, sort of any kind of African gathering or African gathering of nations.
And again, that is one of the fascinating things about that. And in some senses, that's just a statement of fact. The Confederation of African Football was founded before the African Union. We could stop the story there, but there's a lot more to it than that. At the point at which CAF was formed, it was, the African nations were not, were new. They were just gained independence. Now, with some irony, in terms of its ultimate fate, it was largely within the FIFA context, Sir Stanley Rouse, who helped establish the Confederation of African Football. He gave, a voice to those African nations. Now, one can say that's a hugely white patriarchal thing to give. Let me bequeath to, a whole continent their right of expression in terms of football. As the post holder, as it were, as the man in charge of FIFA at the time, that was in his gift. And, he did that. I think, at that point in time, to his credit to a degree, it came with a huge amount of baggage, a sort of white man's burden, as would have been said. And he fundamentally proved to be, controversial at least, and racist, in terms of his attitudes to Black Africa. When he went to South Africa, he didn't see apartheid. He didn't see through his eyes at the time, in the accounts he gave, or a discrimination between access to football between white players and children and Black African players and children. Now, I wasn't there at the time, but I find it hard to believe, given what we know now about South African apartheid, that there was equal access. But he made the case. He was voted down effectively within FIFA. Now, the options on the for CAFs at the time were limited in some senses, but they chose to boycott. They chose not to participate in a qualifying campaign that would have seen one of their nations go forward as the representative into a playoff, which is how ultimately the North Koreans got into the tournament, because they didn't have to play an African team in a playoff effectively to be the representative of other of the rest of the world. They ended up playing Australia, and the Australian team didn't perform when they were perhaps the favourites in those circumstances. So the idea of a Pan-African voice is a really important one in sport, and you see it now in terms of the Basketball Africa League, the BAL. This is something which is a Pan-African movement. Africa is still beset by so many of the colonial legacies of European influence, not least in terms of its borders and geographies. But you see in the BAL a tournament to be held across Africa, 6 cities, 12 teams. Unfortunately, it was scuppered in 2020 by COVID-19. But the idea that you could hold a Pan-African tournament of elite basketball with African athletes was a really important way of considering Africa. And there'll be scholars, more so than myself, who understand and have spent time working in Africa. But to me, sport's a really good example of how Africa can. And I'm conscious even of saying that Africa's a multi-dimensional, multi-ethnic, multi-regional, multi-linguistic, frame of reference, but that it provides an insight into the societies of Africa, which other things don't. In my experience, and in terms of the research that we've done, sport brings people together in a way that other forms of expression don't, but also provides for opportunities and this ideas of sports migration, of coming back into society, of the development opportunities. Now, the development agenda is a whole nother, as it were, ball game, but it provides a huge arc of opportunity within the SDGs of opportunities for education, healthcare, well-being, sustainability. These things really matter, and they matter in many regards more so in Africa, because Africa has been so disadvantaged by the structural systems of the world for so long.
I mean, you make really interesting points, and I think there's so much to be said about sport in Africa. But I think if we're going to have this conversation, one of the things that we need to sort of address, and I feel like I should ask, is the most powerful sporting governing bodies, arguably the FIFA, something like the IPCC, or whatever sporting bodies there are for the Olympics and whatever, in my mind, still are heavily Eurocentric, or the leadership of them are Eurocentric. How does that sort of play into the contributions that African nations or Asian nations can have into the sort of the rules and the structures that are put in place by these governing bodies?
I mean, I think you ask a very good question there, and certainly if you look at the world's governing bodies, the international sporting federations, the ISFs, then you can just look at where they're headquartered, all in in Switzerland, effectively, in an environment where governance is different from other parts of the world, where there's perhaps less scrutiny about stakeholders and accounting and those kinds of things. That's not to pick holes in Switzerland by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a rationale for why sporting federations are all sat there in one country. So they are hugely Eurocentric. Look at the leadership of the IOC. Look at the leadership of FIFA. It's only ever been a European white male. Why? speaking as a European white male, we're a very small portion of the world's population. You know, there's many other people who would represent, this is why going back to the diplomacy of it, represent a sport, a global sport. And if you look at FIFA's website, they talk about it being a global sport all the time, would represent it more effectively. Not least 50% of the population, broadly, are female. You know, look at the disparity of the way that women's sport is represented. You know, where are female leaders in sport? Well, they are there, but they're fighting a hard battle, let me tell you. You know, and again, no patriarch in saying that. They are really trying. There's some excellent female leaders, but they're in a minority. And you know, the structure, as you point out, doesn't lend itself to promoting those individuals in some instances. You know, there are glass ceilings they hit, but also because the structures are so, you know, ingrained. You know, that is a real challenge. You know, the Football Association in the UK banned women's football for over 50 years.
Wow.
You know, so the idea that, you know, you would have you know, an organisation now that represents men's and women's football in the United Kingdom, in England, forgive me, the Football Association, and the fact it's called the Football Association. Everywhere else it's called the French Football Association, the Spanish Football Association. This is the Football Association. The appropriation of that, you know, speaks to power, suggested earlier. So the idea that we're here is some sort of, you know, utopia that sports governing bodies can sort itself out. There have been great strides. The Football Association has made good progress, but it still really struggles with issues of gender, ethnicity, race, in terms of, you know, representation and its communication, and therefore its negotiation. You know, you can rightly point to the elements of, as you can in other industries. The higher education industry is certainly one, government's another, diplomacy is another, where, you know, these balances are not anywhere near represented.
No, that's really interesting. I think one of the things that I mean, for the longest time have you thought about or you know, mentioned to people is the fact that to me it seems like these sort of governing bodies and bodies that make decisions on where a particular sporting event is going to be held, they seem to be run in a very colonial way, in the fact that, for instance, you've had this, you know, there was major uproar when Qatar won the World Cup, and then sort of all these rumors start to surface about all these bribes being handed over and all that sort of stuff. And to me, it just seems like it's a reflection of sort of how the Middle East is run, in the fact that you have to be, you know, pandering to your masters in the West in order to be able to have this real freedom of expression and do what you want to present or showcase your country to the rest of the world.
I mean, I can't disagree with much of what you say there. You look at the way that, you know, Qatar operates, particularly at the moment in, you know, relation to its southern neighbour, Saudi Arabia. You know, this is a geopolitical environment, and, you know, the Gulf as a whole. So you can't ignore that. You can't push it to one side. You can't you know, make anything out other than that, you know, this plays out. But sport can provide, you know, we'll put a spotlight on something. You know, working with the all-party parliamentary group on modern slavery and sport, led by Baroness Lola Young in the UK, you know, there has been progress. You know, do workers in Qatar have the same rights that you and I do in the UK? No. Do they have a lot more rights than they did 5 years ago? Yes. No. So the opportunity, would that have happened without the World Cup? Maybe, maybe not. I think, you know, my reading of the evidence is that the World Cup has brought some change in that sense, has brought a recognition that, you know, some of those practices were, you know, in my opinion, pretty vulgar. But, you know, that's you know, one also has to be culturally sensitive to those environments. That doesn't mean one ignores things or sticks one's head in the ground. But there are cultural proclivities of which I am, as a practitioner of sport diplomacy, guilty of, if you like. That has to be part of the calculation.
Absolutely.
Can I just, I've got to go at 5.
Okay, no worries. Where are we?
We're almost there.
All right, we're almost there. So
because we're having So it's been great.
I appreciate it. Where can people find you online? Are you on social media by any chance, or Twitter?
Yeah. So at Dr. J. Simon Rofe is my Twitter. I haven't ventured onto Instagram yet, partly because I don't have so many good images, but maybe in the fullness of time. And I'm clearly way beyond the demographic for TikTok.
Oh no, let's stay away from that. That's addictive as hell. But Simon, I really appreciate you joining me. And it's a pleasure having you on.
Likewise. If there's anything else I can do, then let me know. We can do a part 2 in when the World Cup comes around, or the Olympics or something.
Definitely. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.